Good afternoon. We're ready to start our fourth and final panel of today. Again, a reminder, thank you to everyone for your cooperation with not discussing pending Ferc proceedings. Please continue on this panel to not discuss the pending Ferc proceedings. I will interrupt if that happens. Our panelists on our last panel are Philip Bartlett II, Chair, Maine Public Utilities Commission; Dan Dolan, President, New England Power Generators Association; Katie Dykes, Commissioner, Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection; Andrew McBride, Director, Ferc Regulatory Affairs, Gas, National Grid; Matthew Nelson, Chair, Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts; Jim Robb, President and CEO of North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC; June Tierney, Commissioner, Vermont Department of Public Service; and Gordon Van Welle, President and Chief Executive Officer, ISO New England. Chairman Glick.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I want to say, first of all, I think we've had three panels. This is the fourth panel. Had, I think, a fascinating discussion on a very important set of issues, and we have an excellent final panel, really, of I guess, people here. So I'm going to get right to the questioning, but I did want to start out by saying something relatively quickly, in the sense that, we have a lot, we've mentioned a couple times today, different people have, including myself, the Uri situation, Winter Storm Uri in Texas, and what happened, and that's obviously, a terrible case scenario. A couple of hundred people died in the United States because they lost electricity. I mean, that's just unfathomable, and that's something that you all and others are working to make sure that doesn't happen in New England. But we have a lot to learn from that experience, in the sense that it wasn't just that Winter Storm Uri happened out of the blue. Something similar had happened a decade before that. And a lot of people did some analysis. I talk to Jim Robb about this all the time. A lot of people did some analysis, and they made some good recommendations, and then no one did anything about it. So I think here, and we have a long history of had the discussions here in the region, and there's a whole bunch these are very difficult issues, not easily solvable. But the point I want to make is that I think we need to, obviously think through this is a beginning of a discussion, but I think it's very important that we not just have these conferences, pat ourselves in the back, and go home and not do anything, because the stakes are too high. So I just want to say that I think this is something we're going to have to give a lot of thought to, and this is the first probably of a number of discussions we're going to have. So thank you all for participating. I'm going to get right to it in terms of questioning. And I'll just ask a very general question for all of you to start, which is, I'm curious, given that you all sat through the last three panels, your takeaways from today and where you think we need to go forward.
Well, good afternoon, Chairman, Commissioners. It's a pleasure to be here. Phil Bartlett from Maine. As I think about this problem, we start with the history, right? We've been talking about energy security for a very long time in New England. We have come up with a lot of solutions, a lot of fixes that we've applied. And then as soon as we do, we just start talking again about the energy security problem and what we need to do to fix it. And as I was driving here the other day, I was sort of thinking that this is like, if you think of energy security as a hole that needs to be filled. It's as if there's a hole of undeterminate size on the other side of a wall that we can't quite see. And it feels like what we've been doing is coming up with solutions, we toss them over the wall. But we don't really know whether it's hit the mark or how much of the hole it is filled. And so we come up with more solutions and more solutions. And I think we're sort of in this situation because we haven't carefully defined and come up with a way to measure what we mean when we talk about energy security or energy adequacy. We know what resource adequacy is. We know how to measure it. There's a real sort of methodology that's been developed around it. But when it comes to energy adequacy, we haven't done that. So, the questions are, how do we measure it? How big is the hole that we need to fill? And how do we know whether and how much any particular fix is going to contribute to improving reliability, improving energy adequacy? And I think going to Commissioner Danley's point earlier, in order to achieve just and reasonable rates, you really need to understand the answers to these questions, right? You need to understand what is the problem, does the proposed solution begin to fix that problem, or by how much, and then is it worth the price that we'd have to pay? In the problem statement that ISO New England put out, Gordon talks about the need to determine how much insurance we need to buy, and sort of puts that to the states to have to figure that out. And I agree. I absolutely agree that that's the key question. How much insurance, how much are we willing to spend to fix this problem? But first, we really need to do the analysis to underpin that, to really inform how big this problem is, and carefully analyze the solutions to assess whether they are truly going to solve the problem. And thinking about, one of the things that was put on the table today and before today is the idea of a strategic reserve. Now, it could be a very, very expensive proposal, right? So maybe let's just say it's going to cost $1 billion to create this kind of reserve. That may be well worth the investment if it's going to make a serious contribution to resource adequacy. But if it's not, then obviously we don't want to do it. And I think part of that analysis has to be very dynamic. We have to understand what the impact is going to be on other market participants to really know what the marginal gain is going to be from that kind of proposal. And I absolutely understand that this is a difficult problem, and we're not going to be able to put a fine number sort of on some methodology. But I think the work that has been started with EPRI, and I think there's a lot more analysis that the states in conjunction with ISO need to do to really begin to define how big this hole is we need to fill, and to make sure that the solutions we're coming up with are making a meaningful contribution. And going to the point that I think you made a little bit earlier, Chairman Glick, there's not going to be a silver bullet here. There's no one fix that's going to do it. So what we need to do is recognize that there's going to be a variety of different solutions, large and small. And I think my ask, I think, of all of you as we move forward is to really put pressure on ISO New England and others that are coming in front of you to do the analysis, to make sure that when a solution is proposed to address energy adequacy, that there's a real core analysis that shows here's the scope of the problem, here's the proposed solution, and here's the kind of contribution it's going to make. Because we simply can't afford as a region to keep spending more and more money not knowing whether we've solved a problem. It's like you wouldn't go to an insurance salesman and say, yep, I'm just going to tell me how much to pay you for insurance. Don't tell me how much that insurance is going to be or what it's going to deliver, right? And I think from the state perspective, I think that's critically important if I'm going to justify the increase in rates that results to achieve energy adequacy. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and very much appreciate not only the invitation, but you all making the effort to come to us in New England as well. We certainly don't take that for granted and recognize the effort that takes on your part and on staff, so thank you. I wanted to take a little bit of a step back, and there has been discussion of some of the history here, and Chairman Bartlett raised some of it. As has been discussed, it was almost 20 years ago that the winter issues in New England really did come more to the fore in front of Ferc. Then we fast forward a little bit, and it was almost exactly a decade ago, which was the last time that Ferc came to New England and had one of these gas electric conferences. I spoke at that one. I know Gordon did. I'm sure many of the other prior speakers did. And it's shocking and terrifying how close the notes and the talking points we had for that one could be reflected today. It was then coming out of that we put in place the original winter reliability programs. Pay for performance was put in place as what we thought was going to be a longer-term market-based solution to that. Fast forward a few more years, we had the operational fuel security analysis, which first really identified Everett. We had the Mystic retirement and the RMR coming out of that. And then we had ESSI, the energy security improvements, which again was meant to be a fuel security answer. That obviously hasn't moved forward, and that happened in 2020. But between that time up until now, we have not seen any more tangible action, despite the fact that even specific to the draft problem statement, we had those issues identified in 2018. We then now also have this RMR in place for another 2 years from now. And so the question is, in this intervening period of time, what, if anything, are we going to do about it? And my concern is, as I see how the rhetoric on this has manifested over the last couple of years, is that we try to have it both ways as a region, where on the one hand, the ISO has repeatedly over the last several winters in the lead-ups expressed deep concern about the precarious situation operationally that exists. And yet on the other hand, as a region, we continually seem to put in place market solutions or proposals that are either inadequate or half measures to these overall solutions. And I am really pleased, reflecting back in particular on the prior panel, but there were elements of this discussion in some of the prior ones, around, I think, a refocusing on the value of reliability. What is the cost associated with that? And I like the term that started being used of an insurance product, and the analogies of, like all of us with insurance, wish we didn't have to pay for it every month, but are really glad we have it in the event something happens. And I think if we can start focusing around that and developing then the market products that can be put in place on a fuel and technology neutral basis that then don't perpetuate the one-off programs that have been put in place for individual fuels, technologies, or even individual resources, we can create a more sustainable structure. As part of that, we are very supportive of the initial priority areas that have been identified and working through, like capacity accreditation that we've spoken a lot about, taking another crack at SE and looking at reserve market enhancements, which I do think are meaningful and important here. And the hope is, collectively through this refocus and valuation around reliability, and accelerating to the degree possible these existing market improvements, we can start getting there. There's obviously a whole lot that we need and can unpack from that, but my hope is that this lays the foundation to take us there.
Well, good afternoon, and I'll echo the appreciation to all the Ferc commissioners for making the trip up here to New England to talk about this uniquely New England challenge. And, you know, this is obviously, as you've heard today, a longstanding issue for folks in the region. I think it's really important to note, at least I'll say in my view, that this has been exacerbated by a capacity market design that's built around the investment needs of natural gas units in a region that is limited in its availability of gas transportation and gas supply. So I think it's really important that we include that fundamental capacity market flaw as part, as we search for a long-term solution. I'll also note that our dependence on fossil fuels in the region and of course around the globe is contributing to the acceleration of climate change, which is becoming the greatest threat to the reliability of the electric grid, which is becoming the greatest threat, or a very significant threat, to decarbonization strategies which are dependent on electrification. So whether you are a regulator implementing a fuel neutral statute, or you're a regulator with responsibilities for energy policy in a state that has a goal to achieve a 100% zero carbon electric supply by 2040, I argue that I think we have a shared mission and a shared responsibility within our jurisdictional constraints to find solutions that will work to achieve both a clean and reliable grid as quickly as possible. I think there's been a lot that's been said today, and so to try to be brief, I will associate myself with the comments of my colleague from Maine that I think we have a real shortage of analytics, which is a bit surprising considering the amount of time that we've been talking about this issue. And I think that this is something that we all recognize for veterans of the OFSA study. I think it prompted a lot of discussion about the need to go further to better define the quantity, and I would also argue the quality of the types of products and services that can address the winter reliability challenge. And I think that the states have been pushing for that for some time, but as we've had to shift to focus on, you know, cost of service contracts and litigating other of the fallout of not having a long-term solution, that continued push for better analytics has gone to the back burner. And I think this conference today and this discussion, I think can align all of us on the need to prioritize better analytics and better product definition. Some will, you know, sympathize with being an energy regulator in a state that has decarbonization goals, but chose to deregulate 2 decades ago, and perceive that there's a conundrum in being in a blue state that has chosen to rely on a fuel-neutral market for energy adequacy. But I think for Connecticut, we are strong believers in competition, in ensuring that generators in the market can be the engine of decarbonization, but it requires us to have clear product definitions that don't just have us reaching for one particular resource or one particular facility, which is something that has happened time and again, but instead, to the extent that the ICE New England could identify the broadest set of products that can provide provide these services, I think that opens us the door for us to have the next productive conversation around the best market solution, to leverage competition to get the resources that we need, and to have the discussion about whose jurisdiction that market solution can best be established under. I have to remark, we've had a lot of discussions about very important technologies and solutions that are out there, and I think that just speaks to the appetite that we all have to leverage a broad range of solutions, not just LNG, but also transmission. I think the discussions on demand response are very dynamic and something that we're very interested in Connecticut. I'll just note that since 2014, that we've been talking about these issues, states like mine have been doing a lot to DIY, in essence, some solutions in this space. We are now 80% of our load is contracted to resources that are needed to address some of these winter reliability challenges. We've contracted 20% of our load to offshore wind, which is materially helping on the medium term. We also signed a contract with the Millstone Nuclear Facility, motivated in large part because of concerns about imminent winter reliability challenges that the entire region would face. I'll note that we're making money on that contract this year, which is always a good thing, but I think it speaks to the extraordinary steps that states have had to take in the absence of having better product definition and market designs. So I'll just finally note other things that have not yet been put on the table today, but certainly with the federal legislation, we were very active in working with our sister states around a hydrogen hub application. I think there may be opportunities for long duration storage for hydrogen, as well as new types of demand response, virtual power plants, other types of resources that can assist. And to really activate and do the right cost-benefit analysis to harness those federal incentives that are coming and marry them with our state jurisdictional programs, we have to have a common understanding of the analytics, of the quantity and the quality of the resources that can solve this on the medium to long term, and we have to start that now, as we are also working towards near-term solutions. So I'll stop there and look forward to be part of this important conversation today.
Good afternoon. I just want to start by thanking the commissioners and all of the Ferc staff for hosting this event and for the opportunity to speak. Picking up on Commissioner Dyke's comment about things that haven't been covered yet today, I want to try and, I guess, insert something new here as well. But to start, I guess, I've heard a lot today about concerns and problems in the market, right, in terms of winter, extreme cold weather instances where in the electric market there are issues of supply-demand gap, resource adequacy, and energy security. And we've also had a lot of discussion today, or heard from a lot of the panelists, on some of the tools that could be used to address this, including additional supply, diversity of supply, demand-side management, and others. I want to state, I guess, one, that I think it's important to note, and I hope everyone comes away from the forum understanding that these same concerns are also present in New England's gas heating market in terms of supply-demand gap tightening and resource adequacy and energy security. I'd also note that I think many of those same tools would apply for addressing that. But I think there's another aspect of it and of ensuring energy security and reliability of the energy systems in New England that hasn't really been touched on today. And that's ensuring that however we go forward, the existing infrastructure in the region is providing reliable service. I think that we're sort of overlooking that and assuming it's true, and in large part that's because it is very reliable, and that's a testament to all of those that operate those facilities. But I think that's an important piece that should be a part of this discussion as well. So, representing an LDC or LDC companies here, LDCs in New England aren't permitted to build a reserve margin into their supply contract planning. And as we've heard today, the pipelines in the region are fully subscribed. There are immense challenges with any kind of new construction or infrastructure expansion. And in those circumstances, I think the reliability of the existing infrastructure that delivers this energy to both gas and electric markets is paramount. And so That's something where, you know, we've looked into that, and we think that that's huge. This is something that's necessary. But when we look at the regulatory framework covering the operation of these interstate pipelines, we're not seeing any agency actively monitoring and regulating the reliability of the services provided by these interstate pipelines. And studying it further, we at National Grid believe that FERC, under its existing jurisdiction and mandate from the Natural Gas Act, has the authority to take on a greater role here and be more proactive in ensuring the reliability of interstate pipeline service. Specifically, and I think most directly, Sections 4 and 5 of the Natural Gas Act, we think not only give the Commission authority over rate making, but also over terms and conditions or quality of service. And we think, you know, using that authority that the Commission, in hosting this event and throughout the day, asking for ways in which it can contribute here in sort of addressing and mitigating these energy concerns in the region, can participate. This is one that we think the Commission should be looking into. And we have some early ideas on what this would look like, including using its authority to encourage or require greater reporting. This would be both enhanced incident reporting when there are instances where, you know, firm service is threatened or curtailed or there are outages, but it would also be reporting industry-wide on an annual basis to provide sort of baseline reporting on reliability metrics. And then the Commission, using this information, could analyze that and, looking for troubling trends, you know, reach out and try and preempt issues before they happen, have communications with these pipelines, and they have rate-making authority, they have audit enforcement authority, civil penalty authority, if necessary, to try and address this. But at the sort of threshold piece of it is the reporting and monitoring and actually using that information to try and make sure that that service on interstate pipelines is reliable for the benefit of gas and electric markets in the region. And again, in terms of short-term, long-term, I think, again, regardless of how we go forward and which tools we utilize, there's going to be a reliance from both gas and electric markets on the interstate pipeline network for the foreseeable future. So this seems incumbent upon all of us to look into this, and I think for the Commission to look for what it can do here as well. And I finally just want to note, you know, I think we don't hear about many instances. There are near misses that happen somewhat frequently, but I think it's, again, a testament to the resiliency of the interstate pipelines themselves and how they operate their systems, to the LDC customers and the alternatives they have in their toolbox to address that. But it isn't a fight that they should be fighting alone. And again, I would urge the Commission to, you know, examine ways that it could use its current authority to try and bolster the reliability and ensure the reliability of interstate pipeline service. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting us to be here today. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. I think that in reaction to the day so far, the question always comes in my mind: why do we have such we have states with strong decarbonization goals, Connecticut, Massachusetts, others, and yet we have a market. And I would say it seems like a paradox in a way, but when you think about where we are, right? We're at the end of the natural gas pipeline. We are exposed to global LNG prices. We don't have the abundant natural resources like the wind in Texas, or even some access to hydro that you see in other areas of the country. We went with a market-based solution for customers because we wanted to get the best price possible for customers. And I think when we look at decisions that the states and others make when we're trying to make sure that this market is functioning well, that's what guides our decision, which is on the reliability side, we've handed both the market and the reliability elements off to ISO New England in a restructured market. And we step in only when we think there's going to be a problem on reliability to customers, and that is why we signed the RMR with Mystic. I think that we can talk a lot about that facility specifically. I think that I will say, as the chair of the Massachusetts DPU, we are in charge of the integrated resource planning for the LDCs in Massachusetts, which use and take from Mystic. They are welcome to bring a contract to the Mass DPU at any time. And just to clear up the record, there's no category about index price or whatever the case may be. They come up with terms that show benefits to consumers, they can bring that to us. The issue is the gas customers aren't the customers that are going to be receiving the benefits. The benefits of that facility are dual, both a need to the gas customers, which can sometimes be done in a contract that's less than a year, because it's something that's meeting an immediate need. But the big benefit is to the regional electrical reliability. And that's the conundrum with that facility. I think that what we would like to do is ensure that if that facility still maintains value, find a way to make sure that this market is recognizing that. Texas had their problems with reliability, and they are putting lots of reserves, lots of insurance products in, whatever you want to call it, because of the experience they had. But we want to make sure that that is balanced and in customers' best interest. I think that our decarbonization efforts we're doing so in customers' best interests. We're going to talk a lot about solutions, I hope, on this panel. I think the question was, is it infrastructure? Is it supply? Is it demand? And there's no silver bullet because it's all of the above. All of those elements are worthy of investigation, exploration, and trying to get at what exactly is the problem. And I think that for us in Massachusetts, we want to be clear that we've known about this problem for a while. This isn't new, right? Our initial administration came in with new gas pipelines, a firm hydro resource, and offshore wind. All three of those things were slated at not being in the position we're in today. And so we want to continue to work on that goal. We're not going to look back and complain about the past, but we want to get past that so that we can continue to offer reliable electricity to customers in New England so that we can electrify, so that they can have faith that whether they have an electrified school bus, an electric car, or they're heating their home with electricity, or whether they're powering their business with electricity, that that is reliable. So that is our fundamental goal. And thank you for inviting me here today.
Well, I'll extend my thanks as well. And I've been pretty outspoken on the issues around gas and electricity and the issues here in New England for a while. So I will try not to continue to foot stomp all the things I've said in many other forums. But a few things I did want to put on the table. One is I'm inherently an optimistic guy, even though my job is to always to look for what's missing. But I am optimistic that we may actually start to break the back of this problem. And part of what gives me confidence around that is the success we've had over the last few months dealing with the consequences of Winter Storm Uri. I think I've described the gas-electric problem as one of the most admired problems in the energy sector. Broadly speaking, I believe that that's true. But since Uri occurred, Mr. Chairman, with your leadership, with a little bit of support from us, and the consequences of that event, you know, we now have a new suite of reliability standards that are almost complete, that will address a number of the issues around winterization. And I think the kickoff of the NASB Forum a couple weeks ago was also a very good start to actually start to address these issues. So thank you for your leadership on that. I do think that the issues around energy security in New England may be the second most admired problem in the energy sector, as many have mentioned, right? This has been talked about a lot. So I am actually very hopeful that we'll move this toward resolution, and I think some of the proposals that have been put forward are good steps towards that, although they're complex for a number of reasons. I did hear a tremendous amount of alignment today on a number of issues. People may describe them in slightly different terms based on where they sit, but it's very clear that there's an insurance pricing problem in New England as to how to value assets that are important for reliability but may not be naturally compensated for in a market. Since that's an economic issue, that has to have a role for Ferc in it somewhere, and I'm not a rate-making expert to know how to do that, but I think that's a very important issue. I think there's also alignment around the issue that extreme weather is not infrequent weather anymore, and we need to change our planning paradigm around what we consider to be the design basis for the sector. And I think there was also pretty general agreement around the notion that luck is not a strategy. Right, and we really need to think about what's needed to get through tail events, which are becoming increasingly more frequent. Generally, no silver bullet. I think everybody understands that. There are a lot of pieces that are going to need to come together to solve this issue, and again, it all has its roots into how to pay for it. I was also quite gratified. I've been doing a lot of work in Europe over the last few months with a little hobby assignment I have with the UN, and obviously the situation in Ukraine, which has been in the background of a lot of the conversation today, has really refocused a number of people in a number of places around how to regain balance to the basic trilemma facing the energy sector, which is how do you advance the cause of reducing the environmental impact of the sector in a way that preserves access and affordability for customers and preserves the reliability of the system, because all those are important to work together. And then the last point I would make, and then I'll yield the floor, is I think we need to think about this whole set of issues as broader than New England. I think New England is at the tip of the spear of a number of issues around energy security, but the conversations that we've had today are not that different from the conversations that we're having in the West, slightly different context. It's not that different from the issues we've identified this summer in the Midwest around the resource adequacy issues in the Midwest. There's this common issue across the sector, which is how do we pay for assets which may not run very much, but are essential to getting through those tail events. And again, I think that's a broader issue than New England, but it's clearly at the heart of the issues we have here today. So with that, I'll yield the floor. And again, thanks very much for having me.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having us here today. I have to tell you, I've been looking forward to this meeting for a very long time. Many of you I've spoken with online. It's good to see that you're real. It's kind of funny, but not really. I have listened to everything today very carefully. You've asked for my takeaway. That entails a certain amount of subjectivity in what I have chosen to take away. What I've chosen to take away is this, Commissioner Clements. Today is not about jurisdictional boundaries. We need to have more days like today, and not only because I enjoy you, but because it is in this room that we have heard from several anchor points in our process, people representing those anchor points, that we have more in common in trying to address the concern that we have here today than not. But if I don't know that you think these things, and I don't hear these things from ISO in your presence, then I don't know we have that shared understanding. And that shared understanding is very important when I go out to speak with Governor Scott's constituents and try to explain to them why, yes, our commitment to a renewably sourced energy on our grid is sincere, real, firm, uncompromising, but if you are trying to get to the safe place that the renewable energy future represents, that future where greenhouse gases aren't choking us to death, that future where California isn't on fire, that future where the New England coastline isn't submerged, you have to get there safely. And what I've heard today is, we're not sure about how to get there, and we're not sure about how to get there safely. What I have heard is there seems to be a growing, emerging consensus around a form of what we're calling insurance product. And right there, I want to discourage the use of that word. It goes so much beyond insurance. It's wisdom, it's prudence, it's recognizing that if you're going to go to that safe place, you've got to build a bridge. And that bridge has to be able to deal with any number of circumstances that can jump out at you, whether it is an unforeseen and yet foreseeable conflict in Ukraine, or it is an adverse weather pattern here in the United States. So I think that's a very promising takeaway for me today. I wanted to run through other commonalities. Commissioner Clements, I I agree with you completely about the role of demand-side management, and frankly, I want to discourage the marginalization of that idea. Just yesterday, the Washington Post ran an article about what's going on in California and detailed the role of 4,500 power walls in reducing demand at just the right moment. That's not nothing. That's not bupkis. It's not the solution. It's not everything. But let us not underestimate the people of the United States. Let us not underestimate the people of New England. If they're called upon the way millions of Californians were on their cell phones to reduce their demand immediately, they will respond. But they have to understand. They have to know. And that education process begins with you and continues through ISO New England to the states. You hear it in several places, the message sinks in, and it has to be clear. Ma and Pa Kettle, you have a role to play in this. The demands you place on our system are the thing that is driving the need to procure this energy to begin with. I could go on about this, but I want to encourage you, Commissioner Clements, and others on the panel who've voiced similar thoughts, to stand firm and to be bold on the concept of what we can do with demand-side management. I also think that we need to guard against the arrogance of thinking that we have at hand here both the jurisdiction and the tools, a complete set of tools, to deal with the problem at hand. The truth is, a lot of our energy requirements are driven by excessively wasteful practices. What jurisdiction does Ferc have over weatherization? None. And yet, if you start with the concept of shrinking an energy envelope, right there you've addressed the problem of what does your market have to solve for. So moving down the line, I don't want to take all the time because my good friend Gordon is going to speak to you shortly, and I've promised not to lob any grenades at him today. I just want to remark, Commissioner Danley, I followed your questioning very closely. It's very energetic and very pointed, and I think I understand where you are headed with your questioning. We agree on this. The question of what are the price impacts on ratepayers is absolutely front and center. The issue isn't that ratepayers should get a free ride or that ratepayers should pay as little as possible for their energy because. The issue is what is just and reasonable for ratepayers to pay. It is just, it is reasonable to require ratepayers to pay that cost, which results in safe, reliable, and increasingly renewable energy. But we have to know that what's being assessed to them by way of cost is fair. And that's uniquely Ferc's job when it comes to the wholesale markets, is to ensure that either the market's working or that the tariffs are fairly and justly drawn. So you've asked what you can do, well, that's what you can do. Commissioner Glick, you haven't mentioned my favorite thing today. I've followed your writings and your speeches very carefully because you have been a proponent of my main tom-tom, which my colleagues from New England will tell you, and that is the role of the state and federal interaction, the partnership, the respect for state sovereignty. I have heard state policies today referred to as pushing dispatchable resources out of the market. And I would simply offer this reframe. It's not state policies that are doing that. It is facts. The fact is California is on fire. The fact is that we cannot continue to burn fossil fuels at the rate we have. The fact is that we need renewable resources for future generations. That's what's pushing these resources not out of the market, but it is pushing a reordering of their priority in the market. And Commissioner Christie, I think I agree with you completely when you said this morning that markets, that these markets are not real markets. You're absolutely right about that, which is why I think the Ferc and ISO need not at all be shy about tweaking these markets to respect the fundamental precept, which is that energy is a public good, it's a public necessity, and it must therefore be accessible and affordable to people whose very lives depend on having that energy. If we have to go to some form of hybrid reintegration, which I gather is anathema to you, Commissioner Danley, to me as a state regulator, that's okay. That's probably because I am something of an anachronism, being a regulator from a state that is not deregulated. But the phrase efficient breach should never be in the lexicon of anybody who is working in this sandbox. There's no such thing as an efficient breach that is tolerable when people can die because we don't have the energy we need when we need it. And yet we saw in Texas that that's what happens when you have strictly market orthodoxy that carries the day in how we organize, how we sell, how we procure, how we deliver energy. Commissioner Phillips, to you goes my admiration for your phrase this morning. You said, if reliability and affordability suffer, sustainability suffers. And I could not agree with you more. What is it we're talking about when we say sustainability? It's not just sustainability of the market. It's, in this case, it's the same sustainability of our very civilization, not to be dramatic. We have to change. And I have to say, when I took office 5.5 years ago, I was shocked to discover that the region had not yet fully understood that states were not choosing to promote renewable energy as a matter of election. They were choosing that as a matter of necessity. And they were doing so because the federal government, not you, I might add, but the federal government has been horribly dysfunctional on this pressing point of national concern. We have needed to make this transition for a very long time. Our progress has been uneven at best, but over the last 5 years, I can say with compliment to you, Gordon, that I really feel the ISO has come along in that direction and has come to understand that things like MOPR, NOPR, et cetera, have not been helpful to us necessarily at getting at the root of the problem, which is how do we plan for and realize our energy future that uses other sources of energy besides fossil fuels. I've probably taken more than my fair share of time. I can assure you I've got commissioner colleagues on this panel who are so tired of listening to me. So I'm now going to pass the microphone to Gordon in friendship and with a lot of respect.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I really appreciate that. And we say thanks, my thanks to the Commission, to Chairman Glegg for organizing this really important conversation. My thanks also go to my fellow panelists, particularly our representatives, colleagues from the states. This is a really important discussion. We need all of your help to be able to resolve the issues in front of us. We can't do this on our own. So you asked about takeaways. There were so many today because there were so many things said, and I don't have an hour, so I'm going to try and keep it to a few minutes. I had prepared some points, which I'll work in a moment, but there were some things that really struck me. But before I go there, let me just say this: the points I want to make today are in the context of a massive transformation that's undergoing our industry, a necessary transformation towards a clean energy system. And we're helping facilitate that through our market structures and through our transmission planning. And so I just wanted to be clear that we're on board with the clean energy transition. I know some have questioned our motives with regard to that. One of the things that really resonated to me, and June just mentioned this again, and it was mentioned several times, I am totally on board with the states doubling down on conservation. I mean, I think to me that's no regrets. Using less is going to help us. And so I think the states have really been excellent. I mean, I think leaders in the nation with regard to conservation, and I really think that is, a no regrets investment. It's not going to solve all the problems, and we need to talk about that too. I wanted to come back to something Commissioner Christie said, and a very astute observation that the ISO really doesn't own any assets. We're a balancing authority. We balance supply and demand. So our folk that you heard from in the morning, their job is just to balance supply and demand, and unfortunately, if supply doesn't match demand, they have to do something about trimming back demand. Of course, we also operate wholesale markets. But the premise of these wholesale markets, when we started this journey 25 years ago, was that they would facilitate transactions between buyers, who represent consumers, and sellers, that is the generators. It wasn't that the ISO should be doing things on behalf of either side of that balanced equation. So there was the idea of balance in the market as well, that suppliers would sell services and buyers would buy those services in order to hedge their own risks. I'll come back to that. With that said, I'd like to step back from some of the details I heard today and make some three high-level points, and then ask a question of this panel and the commissioners, if you are willing to answer the question. So the first big point, and it's been made by many today, but that reliability is fundamental to a successful clean energy transition. And it's easy to say those words. When I think about what's underway here, I think the states are moving forward as they should to procure the renewable resources. But the thing I've tried to do by focusing on the energy adequacy pillar is to really emphasize that we will need significant quantities of stable, long-duration balancing energy, even when we have more renewables on the system. So it's a need today, it'll be a bigger need tomorrow. And that's because of the need to balance the variable resources and the additional demands that will be placed on the system due to electrification. And it's my view that in order to ensure that balancing energy, it will require infrastructure investments and long-term commitments to the people who invest in that infrastructure. So let me come to the second point, which is I've learned three major lessons in the 25-year journey to implement and refine wholesale electricity markets. The first lesson is that society is understandably intolerant of deep and sustained outages of electricity or extreme price volatility. And consumers or voters ultimately expect government to direct industry to ensure reliability. So that's sort of the first lesson. The second lesson is that the market is currently structured, and I'm now referring to the market in New England, but I think this applies to the markets in the US, will not mitigate low probability risks. And that's because the insurance is expensive and it will require long-term commitments, and suppliers will not provide it unless consumers or their agents contract for it. And I don't see any evidence that that is happening. And that raises a question for me that I'll come back to. And the third lesson that we've learned more in the last decade or so is that there are many roadblocks to building new infrastructure, and they're growing. And this needs to be addressed if we're going to be able to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. And therefore, I'd say the region needs to be careful not to retire needed existing infrastructure until we are sure it is clear it is not needed. And that's not what we're doing at the moment. We're retiring infrastructure on the hope that new infrastructure will be replacing it. So this brings me to my final point, and that's we recognize that there are currently legal limits to what the Ferc and the state regulators can do under their respective jurisdictions to address these challenges. And this in turn may well constrain what is possible through wholesale market design and state mechanisms. I'm very aware of the fact that the ISO is tasked with maintaining bulk power system reliability. And one of those tasks is if supply doesn't meet demand, we have to call for distribution system outages to reduce the demand. But that leads to a question. I've really been struggling with this question of who's responsible for mitigating the impacts of these low probability risks to end customers and consumers. So here's my question to all of you. Given the divided authorities, who should make the judgment of how much risk of outages customers should bear and whether to mitigate the risk to acceptable levels? Is this the responsibility of the state or the federal regulators? And I think we need a clear answer to this question in order to proceed with a productive conversation on solutions. So let me stop there, and I'd be happy to engage in questions and answers. Thank you.
I was going to say the ISO is responsible. No, just kidding. No,
Well, then that means the FERC's responsible.
I'm just kidding. Well, in that case, no. No, I want to, in the interest of time, I want to allow all of our colleagues to ask questions. So I'm going to move on to Commissioner Danley. I'm sure we'll come back to this.
Thank you. So I have two questions, keeping in mind that I'm always interested in what the specific thing is that we can do and do within our authority. We don't have any plans for this winter, and no specific fuel, this is to Gordon, no specific fuel security program in place. The ISO has said that if it's a mild or moderate winter, things will probably be okay. Otherwise, we could have real problems. So the question to you is, given our authorities, and this is the first of two questions I have, given the authorities we have, what is the proper action for us to take if indeed we are responsible to ensure that our jurisdictional markets can perform the duties that they've been tasked with? Do we 206 you for the 20 BCF? Do we 206 somebody else? If not, why not? Tell me if the basic premise of my question is wrong, but I'm curious what action you think we at the Commission should take, given the fact that we're going into this winter basically crossing our fingers and hoping.
Well, so as you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I'll do my best to pretend to be a lawyer.
Sure.
So James Daly said it on the previous panel, and you've just said it as well. To cover that risk, we need an additional 20 BCF or so of LNG into the region. And the question is, how do you get that? So, the question is, what could Ferc do about that? You could, if you had a magic wand, which I don't think you do, you could authorize the ISO and direct us to go sign a contract with St. John LNG to bring in 20 BCF through St. John, because you wouldn't want to put more through Everett. It's really to put more in through St. John. But my guess is you're going to tell me that the Federal Power Act does not allow you to authorize us to do that.
That's kind of where I'm going.
Okay. Am I doing okay as the
Yeah, this is, I had hoped that's what you were going to say, and thank you. Yeah.
So what you could also do, I suppose, is, the one thing I'd caution you on is please do not issue a 206 unless you issue it with clear guidance. Because this is such a complicated problem. If you issue a 206, you're going to shut down communications between the parties that have to resolve the problem. And we've walked that road before, it was not helpful. So I think a 206 can be helpful if you give us clear direction. So if you were to give us a 206 and say, ISO, direct all the gas generators to sign LNG contracts through St. John LNG terminal, that would be helpful. To say to us, ISO...
One question I have is longer term one, and I'm going to begin by begging Commissioner Christie's indulgence to correct or maybe add a nuance to the point that you raised earlier that he had, that the ISO is a balancing authority. And you said this yourself, it's a balancing authority plus a capacity market. And if we're being told that the ISO is unable to procure through market mechanisms the attributes that it needs, right, and so the question I'm left with here, and this is sort of piggybacks on Chairman Glick's point about finger pointing. I am concerned that the ISO, operating under the constraints of the region, which are both policy constraints and physical, that is, we have laws that are enacted and we have actual physical capacity limitations, that it's unable to be blamed for something that it can't do anything about. Would it not be appropriate, given my deep and longstanding regard for the commandeering clause, would it not be appropriate for us to simply give all of that responsibility back to the states? That way there is one sovereign that's in charge, one to in the past as an actuarial reality. If things continue in New England as they have been, it is actuarially certain that on a long enough timeline there's going to be a disaster. And so given that fact, would it not be worth exploring the Commission 206ing ISO?
Is that a question for me?
That is indeed a question for you.
Okay. I was.
And I'm not even going to insist that you answer it. You can shrug your shoulders. I ask this in sincerity because somebody has to be
contemplating all the fuss around the minimum offer price rule and where to go with the capacity market. And I'll remind you that the reason we have a capacity market today is because the states insisted that we should not do a price. And this was when Joe Kelleher was the chair of the Ferc. And there was a lot of resistance from the states at that time. our part because we knew it was going to be complicated. But we've done it, and we've done it 17 years in a row now, and we've learned some things along the way. But it's been a very hard road to make that capacity market work. It was the Texas model. So at that point, this was 2020, Winter Storm Uri had not yet happened. So we're sitting there in our offices, and part of our strategic planning discussions, we're thinking, because it would have the effect that you describe. It would really put load back in the driver's seat with regard to responsibility for the outcomes. And we were proven correct in that judgment a year later when the Texas event happened. So when that event, and so that confirmed for me, actually. And, since then, what we've seen happen, we've seen the same story play out in Australia and New Zealand and in other markets where you just have the market come up with a structure for replacing the capacity market with something comparable, is my guess. But that's why I said what I said to begin with. I mean, ultimately, these...
Thank you. So, Chair Nelson.
Just a quick comment, and I'm certainly not riding in on a white horse to defend the capacity market, but I do think that the capacity market was designed to deal with availability of resources in the summer. I'm not saying it doesn't get close.
Right, unit
Yeah, I
needed
agree
a contract,
with you.
and
In fact, what we already have is a kind of hybridized reintegration. That's true. One thing we can do, though, to stop finger pointing down the road is to say, let's not make it hybridized. Let's just kick it back to the states, who are ultimately the sovereign that has all residual power, and let them handle it. And then, when something bad happens, if something bad does happen because the states don't take proactive action, they'll know exactly who it is that is responsible for it, and then political consequences will attend, right? And I don't need to be worried about whether or not the region will receive something well, right? We can act under 206 as the instrumentality of the federal government. So anyway, I'm sorry.
No, but
took over
with
from
all
you.
respect, I think that would be a pretty costly way of having the conversation around how to meet resource adequacy in terms of, public health and safety with reliability consequences. But I think I'm a believer in the ISO. I'm a believer as a member of a 6-state RTO, right? That the ISO has a critical role in helping 6 states, 6 sovereigns, have a common conversation about what is resource adequacy and what resources can be used to solve it. And I think that's why I point to underscore Maine's
To be
Chairman
clear,
Bartlett's point.
I'm not suggesting that FERC abolish the existence of ISO New England. I'm not saying that we revoke their corporate charter and tell the members of the board to scatter to the 4 winds. What I'm saying is you take away one of their functions. And there is going to be a residual function like NEPOLs going forward in New England, almost certainly, no matter what happens. So you don't need to be worried about the fact there isn't a convening authority or somebody in the region that is going to be in charge of doing balancing authority activities. That's certainly going to be there. So don't overstate what I'm getting at.
Well, I'll leave it there. I think my colleagues have more to say. Thank you.
Yep.
So I want to pull on 3 threads that seem to be coming out of this. The first being that, as has been described, that the markets may be inadequate to meet these low probability, low frequency events. And yet the second is, as we've talked about numerous times today, the frequency of these events is increasing. So to what degree are we talking about low frequency events? And then that goes to then my third point, which is probably the most troubling, which is now hearing that the market operator believes that a market-based structure and reliability through markets, which is what we've been trying to build here the last couple of decades, is inadequate to meet these needs that are increasing in frequency and impact onto the region. And I reject that notion. I believe that we can and should and have a responsibility to develop those products, do it in a market basis, and move fast. I'll leave it there.
So what you're saying is you're thinking about your own 206. Got it. Okay. Sorry, did you want to respond?
I mean, I guess I'll just add very briefly. I mean, I think as a region, or at least Maine, we certainly believe in markets and believes that we should leverage them to the maximum extent possible to improve reliability. And if there's still issues around the edges, then we need to deal with them. I do think if the lights go out, we're all to blame. There's not going to be any point in finger pointing because we're all going to be on the hook. And whether ISO has responsibility for resource adequacy or we do, everyone involved in this project of the energy system are going to be on the hook. The question, in devolving it to the states doesn't solve the core problem, which is how do we as 6 states fully assess what the energy security problem is and how do we fix it? And I think the benefit of the current structure is that there is an entity that is responsible, a single entity that we can all work with to figure out what is the answer to that question. And to me, that is where we need to go over the next several months and year, is to figure out what is the extent of this problem, and then let's figure out all the market solutions, and if we need some out-of-market solutions as well, fine, but let's figure out how to solve this problem in the most cost-effective way possible.
I appreciate the framing of that rebuttal. Thank you. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Commissioner Dinley. Commissioner Clements.
Thank you all. Really insightful introductory comments. I appreciated the chance to hear them. Chair Bartlett, you left off where I was going to start, which is I'm still left at the end of the day wondering what is the scope of the problem? Maybe insurance is a bad analogy, but it's like, am I buying flood insurance? Am I buying car insurance? Is my 18-year-old with the red Corvette going to be on my insurance? Is it a term policy? Without that kind of information that you're suggesting we can take next steps your region can take next steps to do, it's hard to get specific. It's hard to say how long we need each of these solutions that have been put on the table, and there's lots of good solutions on the table. So that's number one to me, is just to affirm that perspective, and I think it was shared by the other states. But I'll collapse my 2 questions into one, which is I asked about this short of the dramatic example of devolving, which to me suggests a lot more likelihood of outages than working together as a region to ensure against them for that set of days in the year where we have that risk, even if it's every year. We heard on the last panel that, and we heard in Commissioner Dyke's opening comments that there's improvements, there's evolution to the way the capacity market works that are going to be really important. And one of those is I'm sorry who said this, getting at, Chair Nelson, getting at the winter reliability risk. That we can do seasonal capacity markets, we can think about capacity accreditation, we can think about the right kind of incentives for the resources on the capacity front that also sends the signal to reduce demand during those periods. But in any case, I'd be curious on the state's perspectives, and then if Gordon has a reaction to them about the opportunity for those changes in the market and if they can make a difference. And then I forgot my second question collapsed into it, is this question about the opportunity on the demand side resources. And if you as the states are going to be drivers of this opportunity, are you getting the information you need and the signals you need to ensure that those programs can make a difference? Thanks.
So lots to unpack there, but let me try to start. So I think the summer is all about, do you have enough generation to meet the peak, right? And the peak is a few hours. I think the winter, I've been thinking about it, and I'm sure Gordon does too, is 21 days, right? 21 days of fuel supply. And the question and why it's such a dangerous event is our fuel runs out in 21 days. So the question that I think we need to ask is, how do we extend that 21 days to 22 days, to 23 days, to 24 days? Because every day you put on that amount by either adding a supply resource or having a demand event that allows time to get cargo into the region to refill the tanks, one of those two things will buy you more time and thus make that probability of that event happening less. And so I think for us, I always think about this as something like a seasonal forward. How do we look at a forward-based market that is doing a procurement for ensuring we have enough resources in the winter period? Now, I'm not a market expert. We heard a lot from market experts today. ISO is. But then the second part of your question is around demand. And I think you know, I worked a lot on demand response prior to coming to the commission, and the summer was very clear how to do it. Winter was a lot more challenging, and I think it was a lot more challenging because there's no price signal there. What you're actually going after, what the market is trying to come and get, is confusing, I think, to the market. Like we talked about long duration storage, and Patrick Woodcock mentioned, you know, negative pricing combined with this period of time. That seems really good for long duration storage, but I think working with ISO to develop a market and get us market signals that gives us winter pricing that will actually help extend that 21-day period into a longer time frame, you will see market participants show up and try to come in the middle at day 14 and give you a time to get from day 14 and get extra fuel into the region so that you can extend that time period and shorten the window of how risky that period in New England's going to be.
Thank you. I will not repeat, but just underscore and echo everything that Chair Nelson said. I think that that's absolutely critical. Capacity accreditation, moving away from simply summer peak as the critical feature for the design of our ICR. You know, all of that, all those reforms become possible when we have more analysis and better understanding of the products and services that are needed and the types of resources that can be qualified to perform them. I'll also note, I think the comment was made earlier that FERC, you know, to the extent that the driving question is what can FERC do, you know, you may look out and say, well, you know, FERC doesn't have jurisdiction over weatherization programs. You're not running the efficiency programs. But I can say as someone who is overseeing those programs, when we're testing the cost effectiveness of all of the various programs that we're funding with those conservation load management programs, we're benchmarking that cost effectiveness against avoided capacity costs. And so that's where our respective jurisdictional silos interact and can complement one another if we have the right product definition in the capacity market. The removal of barriers to state investments through with the elimination of the MOPR is an example of another important reform that enables that positive and complementary integration of our respective markets. But that's why it's so core for us to get those price signals correct in the capacity market as well as ancillary services and energy markets as well.
Thank you. I think the way you frame the questions is really useful because it points to the fact that there are many, many solutions on both the supply and the demand side that are ultimately going to solve this problem over the medium and long term. The most important thing is that we keep emphasizing is to define the problem clearly and measurably so that the market can respond, because you can develop the incentives to get what you want as long as you can measure the contributions of each of those inputs that are submitting into the market. You know, demand response doesn't have to solve the problem in of itself, but it shouldn't be discarded because if it can make a significant contribution and then 10 or 20 other potential solutions can come in with a small contribution, that's going to get you there just as well as the big fix. I think the problem we've had in the region is we start talking about the problem, but before we get it clearly defined, we're jumping to the next solution. And it's easy to do, but especially because of the urgency of wanting to do something in the short term, to just jump and lock onto something as if it's the sole thing. But I think we're ultimately going to fail if we keep doing that, because if we want to develop a sustainable market over the long term during this transition, it really is going to take the hard work to figure out how do we measure what it is we need so that we can go procure it.
Commissioner Tierney.
Thank you. Your initial question, Commissioner Clemens, was would we be driving things like demand-side management, what we want to call them, activities and whatnot. And my answer to that would be we are. We have a natural gas efficiency utility in Vermont. We have electric efficiency utilities in Vermont. We have a gazillion public service campaigns about efficiency, et cetera. Very gently and with all due respect, what is FERC doing on this issue? Now, Chair Glick, you won my heart when you fully staffed and resourced the Office of Public Participation for the first time in 40 years. the only time, actually, our first time. They're going to do a bang-up job, I know. But what are the cues that the Ferc is sending to New England? What are the cues that the Ferc is sending nationally? To the question, gee, shouldn't we just give resource adequacy back to the states? I don't think you've heard any takers here. I hope you had fun asking that question, Commissioner Danley. And I think there's a reason that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. I'm not as well equipped as my other colleagues from the state commissions here to speak to the finer points of the markets because Vermont's posture is so different. It's derivative at best in the region of how choices are made to structure the markets. But I can say this, historically we came together because we had a common purpose in the region. And then from that evolved this structure that we have today under the auspices of the Ferc. There's no question about who's responsible if things go south. As I think Commissioner Nelson or Commissioner, Phil, what's your last name, Bartlett, said, we're all on the hook, but you know what? That conversation is unseemly today. This is so not about who's to blame. This is so not about who's in charge. It's so painfully obvious that we're all in this together. And more importantly, that there's a federalism issue here that goes to the national import of what you do, not just our regional import. The nation has an interest in New England being safe and secure in the winter. And we share that interest in other parts of the country as well. And your proof is what happened in Texas. You know, Texas is not interconnected. Texas is its own little fiefdom. Texas got to do everything Texas wanted to do, and Texas paid a terrible price. But I followed the coverage very closely, and it didn't take any time at all for it to emerge that the Ferc had inquired of Texas, had studied Texas, had recommended that Texas do things. You did your jobs. You need to do them here too. And one of those jobs is to send the appropriate signals as to what you find acceptable. I'm under the impression, Gordon, that ISO New England has proposed a couple of winter reliability programs in the past, and they were met with, how shall I put it, not a lot of love from Ferc. I do know that I slept better during those winters as a state regulator, knowing that when Governor Scott called, I'd have something to say about what we did. We supported ISO in those winter reliability programs. I gather we're in the position that we're in this year because you made a decision that we did not need to file for such a thing. If I've got that wrong, you'll push back on me. And I further got the sense that you didn't want to file for one of those because you didn't think Ferc would approve it. If that's the case, what signal are you sending to ISO New England, who exists to facilitate solutions to these kinds of problems? I hope that was helpful. I put you on the spot, too.
Thank you. You have a tendency to do that, Commissioner Tierney. So there was a lot there, and it's going to take me a while to respond, so I'm just warning you. So I'll come back to your question in a minute. So I first wanted to talk about the energy adequacy gap and how do you get at that gap. And you raised the question of quantification. So, you know, what I'd say is that we have already quantified this gap, but it was resisted or not accepted. So the operational fuel security analysis was our first attempt to quantify this gap. I think it was directionally correct, and we got a lot of negative feedback on it because people challenged our assumptions, and people said at the time we were being too conservative in our assumptions. And we ended up backing down, actually, over the next several years because we said, well, okay, maybe we are being too conservative about how quickly the renewables are going to come on. It turned out we were right. So, you know, what that study said was we need a lot of LNG. And if we don't have LNG in the region, that's going to be a problem. And so you fast forward to this year and last year, when I asked the control room, what will it take to cover a winter of 2013-14 with today's resource mix, given that we've lost 5,000 megawatts of resource since that time? They tell me, assuming that we run the oil units with the 100 million gallons of oil in storage, we're going to need 50 BCF on top of that, right? And we're expecting about 31 BCF is what we said. So that says the gap today is roughly 20. Now we are going to refine that number. I mean, the whole point of the EPRI study is to be more precise than that and to look out ahead and say, getting the best minds in the industry in terms of what extreme events might look like in the future, what's the probability of us being exposed, and are there other times of the year that we should be worried about? But my point is we have quantified the risk, right? It's just that people, it's such a big number that people don't want to deal with it at this point. So I think that's the issue. And we have to obviously improve the precision of the number, and the number will be dynamic over time because the number will go up and down depending on what we bring into the system that's new and what leaves over time, coupled with what we're adding to demand from electrification. So it'll be a dynamic number. And once we've developed a tool, we can use that tool to update the forecast, if you want to call it that, on the energy adequacy gap. So a much higher level of sophistication than what we do today on the 21-day look ahead, which is sort of a narrow thing. So then you start having a conversation about how do you get at this problem through a market. And I heard lots of people during the course of the day talk about we need to solve this through a market. And I think there's limits to what you can do. I do think that market improvements will narrow the energy adequacy gap. That's clear to me. And there are certain things we need to do that are no regrets investments in market design that will narrow the energy adequacy gap. Improved capacity accreditation is one of them, okay? So, and then improved ancillary services, real-time ancillary services is another, and we're on a journey to do that. But let me just talk about ELCC for a moment, improved capacity accreditation. There are limits to what that will do to narrowing the energy adequacy gap. We're going to run a bunch of studies, but at some point, if a resource has got 24 hours of energy behind it, we're going to have to say that's 100% capacity value. Because we can't say that every resource has to have 2 weeks of energy behind it, because then you'd narrow it down to just a few resources in the entire market. So definitely, improvements in capacity accreditation are going to narrow the gap because it's going to turn the screws on the incentive to go out and invest in more stored energy on the system. That's what it will do. But my question to you is that going to be sufficient to deal with the unexpected events? So the way I'm thinking about it now is that a market will solve for the expected value of a coming season. So put yourself in the generator's shoes. You look at the NOAA forecast. Is it a mild winter or cold winter? You look at what you've sold forward against the standard offers in bilateral transactions, so you know what your commitment is looking forward. And you look at your risk, your pay for performance risk, and you do your calculation and you say that's how much fuel you're going to buy and put in the tank. That's what you heard in some of the panels. They're not saying, because we're generous, we're going to hedge the 2013-14 winter on behalf of everybody in New England. The person who makes that bet is being foolhardy because they may be stuck 9 out of 10 winters with a bunch of fuel that they can't get cost recovery on. So that's why I say the market is going to solve for the expected value. So then you ask yourself the question, how do you get the market to solve for the unexpected value? And I think as I look around what's happening in the rest of the world, government is creating some regulatory obligation or backstop to the market. So we had the executive vice president of Nord Pool meet with our board some 3 years ago. Nord Pool is the power pool that operates the Nordic countries. And they've got lots of renewables on the system. I mean, most of the time they're running off renewables. So we asked them, how do you keep it together? And they said, well, they have a rule which says they keep 2 weeks of energy in reserve, right? So they have an energy reserve, 2 weeks to cover the period when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. It's been instructive to me to look at what's happening in Europe. I didn't realize that if you look at Germany, Germany says, I'll let the market operate if you have 90% storage levels going into the winter. And if you're not there, we'll intervene in the market. So there's another example of government stepping in and saying, we're going to put boundaries around this. So then you say, okay, maybe we need an energy reserve. Now the question is, do you put it in the market or you put it on the side of the market? So if you're going to put it in the market, I mean, the right economic theory is to put it in the market. But there's a consequence to doing it that way. Because in real time, everything that delivers electrical energy should be valued equivalently. That's the market theory. But if you put that requirement into the market and you run short of that requirement, you should then cascade that shortage price signal across every energy provider in the market in that moment. That's what marginal pricing economic theory does for you. If you take the gap that I described and you try and plug it into a market clearing mechanism like that, and you're short of that quantity, like we will be this winter, it's going to produce a massive multiplier effect in the market pricing. And we ran into headwinds on that on a much smaller scale with the Energy Security Improvements Project that we filed at the Ferc back in 2020, where there was a lot of pushback around an ancillary services product that had a range of $70 to $200 million at that time. So I asked myself the question, if we were to try and solve this gap through a uniform clearing price mechanism that cascades across all energy suppliers in the moment, would the region support such a mechanism? I'm not sure. So I think that's why we need to sit down and talk about how to do this. Are we going to do it in the market or are we going to do it outside of the market? So then coming back to Commissioner Tierney's question about this winter. And so we were asked in May to look at, could we use one of the programs that we'd used before to mitigate the risks for this coming winter. So we knew at this point already, halfway through the year, we did not have time to invent something new and get it through a stakeholder process and get it approved by Ferc in time for people to start buying fuel, because really the fuel procurement cycle starts here in the fall or before that. And what we don't want to do is create uncertainty around what we're going to be doing either. So we said the thing we would look at were two existing programs, one of which we'd used in the past, and the other was IAP. In the middle of the process, we got the DC Circuit saying that IAP has been shrunk down to just oil and gas. But so we looked at those two programs, and we looked at, would those two programs as currently designed provide any incremental value for this winter? And the answer was no. We did not think it was going to provide. Those two programs were not going to provide any incremental value for this winter. What would provide value would be some new program that told every generator to fill up their tanks going into the winter and put somebody on the hook to buy 20 BCF through St. John, but like Germany is saying to its industry. That would actually do some good. But to design such a thing and get it through the regulatory system and have it be approved in time for winter was an impossibility. So that's why we are where we are.
I'm past time, thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Clements. Commissioner Christie.
Yeah, I just want to go back and answer the question that Gordon asked a while back. He deserves an answer to it. I don't think he got a straight answer, but I think you asked who is actually responsible for resource adequacy, and I want to answer that. Ultimately, it is the states. Of course it is. Only the states have the police power to regulate utilities, and states make a policy decision how they want to regulate their utilities. And Gina, you're absolutely right. I respect the state's authority to do that. There's a lot of models out there. You can be vertically integrated. You can go into an RTO. Even within the RTO model, there's a bunch of variations. SPP doesn't even have a capacity market. MISOs is purely residual. But ultimately, it's the state's police power that determines how the lights stay on. I mean, that's absolutely true. The ISO is not a regional IRP planner. FERC is sure not a national IRP planner. So ultimately, these decisions are really matters of state policy. And how you, and what you want from your ISO is really your decision. What you want from your ISO, whether you want to be in an ISO, it's your decision. When Virginia went into PJM, I can tell you I was on that commission that voted to do that. And we didn't think for 1 second that we were, quote, giving resource adequacy to PJM. No way in bad word did we think we were giving resource adequacy to PJM. We knew we were still responsible for resource adequacy. Of course we were. So I think that's important to know, because when you all look at solutions, and I say you all because ultimately it's the state policymakers that have to decide. When you all work for solutions, whether it's what your governor's proposed in that letter, which is potentially an energy reserve, whether it's continuing to push for tweaks to the ISO market because you want different things out of the ISO market, whether it's a decision to have a hybrid of some rate-based assets and maybe some market-based assets, whatever is the ultimate outcome. It is under your state police power authority. Of course it is. And so whatever solutions come, it's going to ultimately be a matter of state policymakers making that decision. And I certainly respect that.
Is there a question?
I mean, I'll buy it. I mean, on this one, I mean, I think while it is true that the states could always take resource adequacy back and take that responsibility away from the ISO, we've made the collective decision to put that in ISO's camp. And as part of that, we have less say, right? We don't dictate how the markets are structured. That comes through Ferc. And so, and there are other stakeholders through NEPOOL that weigh in. So we have sacrificed some of that decision-making authority. Yes, we can always walk away, but I don't think that's constructive. I think the way we solve this problem is with ISO's leadership and state partnership and your leadership to come up with a clear problem statement, a clear way of measuring measuring the problem and how to solve it, and then let's get there. And I think it's important to not just look at the gap between where we are today. Gordon's point about the 20 BCF, I don't think that's quantifying risk. I think that's quantifying a need. And I think that's very different. And it certainly isn't quantifying the potential impact. What happens if we had 10 more BCF? Is the risk really the same as it is currently? Do you have 20 BCF or nothing? Does that not change the likely outcome and the impact? This is the kind of more, I think, dynamic, robust analysis that we need so we can figure out how to make changes around the margin. And I think ISO is uniquely situated to drive a lot of that analysis and to bring solutions forward because of where they sit and overseeing the markets and the bulk system.
I think the other thing that I'll note about that is, and I agree with you, resource adequacy, at the end of the day, the states have what I think is the final say in it. But the talent and the intelligence and the modeling and the expertise that ISO has accumulated far outstrips that I would have at my own agency, right? So handing it back to the states, we would not be in the driver's seat of being able to see the market the same way ISO does, nor would I have any jurisdiction over what's happening in Connecticut or New Hampshire or Vermont or Maine or Rhode Island. And I think that the regional benefits are clear, that doing it on a regional basis has value. I don't think we want to start creating individual IRPs. I think there is a lot of pressure with incorporating some of the state's goals in with the ISO. I actually think that ISO needs more resources because I think the pressures being put on them are growing. And I think that making sure that they have the budgets and the adequate staff to keep up with the pace of change that's going on right now is critical. I think we're going to be asking them to do more, not less. I think we're going to want to see how FERC Order 2222 actually gets integrated in the market and can and will help this situation. I think we want to figure out how we can look at a day-ahead market, a forward market, a seasonal market, to try to develop ways to have a better understanding of what fuel we need when. But at the same time, the states are not deaf to the fact that we have ultimate authority and that sometimes there will need to be out-of-market solutions. We've suggested the strategic reserve because in Massachusetts, we're having people, in the 70s who heated their home with oil, and we're trying to transition them. We transition them to natural gas, and I do integrated resource planning at the DPU for or oversee it. The utilities do it, we oversee it for natural gas. And I think we're trying to move them now to electric heating. And so the strategic reserve that we've had in the past needs to evolve with the changing policies as well. And we want to partner with ISO to get there. But it isn't just one or the other. It's all of these things kind of happening simultaneously.
I'll just say, Commissioner Christie, I think that your characterization of the state's role in New England with respect to resource adequacy is not exactly what our experience has been, or certainly we were disabused of that perspective at the DC Circuit some years ago when we were challenging the capacity market. So, you know, when we, anyway, I'd be kind of curious to see if Gordon shares your perspective on the state's role with respect to resource adequacy. We certainly would be interested in having 205 rights, but we don't have those either. So, but I will say, you know, because we've been talking about the winter reliability program, I want to highlight that experience from this past summer as something that I thought was very healthy for the New England region, which was that after, you know, requests from the states and from many NEPL stakeholders, the ISO took the responsibility, which I believe is primarily theirs, and this is what they're best positioned to do the analysis about whether they felt that a winter reliability program would be needed for this winter. And that information was shared with NEPL stakeholders and with the states in a time frame that was sufficient for a decision, you know, to be made. And the ISO was on the record with their recommendation about whether they felt that it would be valuable to advance such a program to Ferc, and we were able to have a discussion and understand the reasons why they felt that that was not needed, and Connecticut was supportive of that position from the ISO for this winter for that particular program. I think that's exactly the kind of open dialogue and that we need on the medium term and the longer term, that starts with the ISO and their position of advantage as the grid operator to advance the information to the stakeholder process to help people understand the scope of the problem. Gordon's discussion there about the in-market versus out-of-market is exactly the kind of leadership that we need from the ISO to help guide the region in assessing which style of solution is better. It's a world of difference from saying we need to procure this particular resource in this location. So I hope we can have more of the former. I think that is exactly what I think this technical conference, I hope, will lead to here in the region after everyone's departed. Thanks.
Do you have anything else? Commissioner Phillips.
Mr. Chairman, there's zero chance I'm going to open up another round of questioning at this point. I'll just make a couple observations real quick. I could compliment everybody on this panel. I could talk about something everybody has said that is poignant and something that we can take away from this process. I won't do that now. I will just remark upon two things. One, Mr. Robb, it struck me that when you started your conversation about your takeaways from today, you started with the response that we made to Winter Storm Uri and how we came back with reliability standards to address that, and that is now, that situation's moving in the right direction. I'll also just talk really quickly about Mr. McBride, how you said, and it intrigued me, your point about gas reliability standards. And you laid out some details that I hadn't heard many people lay out the way you did. I thought it was very thoughtful and something that if I had time, boy, we'd be talking about it. With that, I thank you all. You won't hear from me again. I'll turn it back to Mr. Chairman.
Well, I'm going to reserve my comments to my closing comments to the end. I just want to thank a bunch of people. So, but I want to give our colleagues some time if they want to make additional closing statements, and I'll start with Commissioner Danley.
Yeah, so I'll make this really quick to kind of put a final point on the insurance paradigm that was put forward. Insurance can be very expensive, and we know how much it should cost, right? In Carroll Towing, Learned Hand had the famous formula, right? It's the likelihood of the event times how much it's going to cost you, and that's how much you should be willing to pay in premiums. And when you're in a region that has constraints and doesn't have a superabundance of power or fuel, that can be a very, very expensive prospect. So you have to be ready to pay, and it's going to hurt if you actually achieve that insurance objective. We have two things, a short and long-term problem. I've kept coming back to this. Short-term, it looks like it's hopes, prayers, and the magical 20 BCF if it's needed. Let's hope it's not, right? On the long term, we have a problem here, which is that I just don't think that if I were to poll the audience, that many people here would believe that the eventually unreliable and currently very expensive rates in this region are JNR. And if the stakeholders don't come up with a 205 to file, at a certain point somebody's going to 206 ISO New England, and eventually it will be us because we have a statutory duty to ensure JNR rates. And so I'm just saying that something has to be done to be fixed, to fix it. And it is hard to imagine this set of circumstances where we are, as an earlier panelist mentioned, tracking individual LNG tankers because we're desperate for the arrival of the fuel needed to keep things running. I don't see that lasting for very long. Eventually, FERC will step in. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Clements.
Thanks. A lot of insightful stuff today. I guess I hope that the opportunity is not as black and white, all or nothing, as some of these suggestions would imply. You know, when you think about the opportunity to close that energy adequacy gap, there are things that you can do that will help this winter, and I hope that as stakeholders in the region, you'll huddle after this, after processing this, and think about for this winter and next winter. And then there's a whole set of things that you can start now that won't help this winter and next winter, and we've heard about a lot of them. Gordon highlighted this issue of in-market versus out-of-market. Well, we can get a lot of the way in-market. He talked about seasonal, he talked about capacity accreditation, but we can also talk about a seasonal construct. We can talk about ensuring that the signal of that winter reliability risk gets incorporated. We can talk about tightening the screws on pay for performance. So there's a real opportunity there, I think, that I'm committed to certainly, and I'm energized about coming out of today's conversation, and I look forward to engaging with many of you on that topic. So thanks so much.
Commissioner Christie?
Yeah, I think it's been a great day, and I've learned a lot. And Commissioner Dykes, I'll take that court case from the D.C. Circuit you referenced. I wonder where the D.C. Circuit had stripped states of their inherent police power, but a couple judges on there probably do it if they got a chance. But I think it's been a great day to look at all the various options, and there's a whole range of options, and we talked about a lot of them today, and I look forward to hearing more from people of New England and to you all as regulators about, how those options go. The governor's letter, I thought, raised a lot of raised some good prospects of options, and I think we heard more about it, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it as days go on. But thank everybody for coming, and it's been a great day as far as I'm concerned. Very educational, very informative. Thank you.
Commissioner Phillips? I'm all good. Okay, great. So I'm not going to keep us here much longer. A couple of things. Again, I want to thank you all and thank everyone else that participated today. This was an interesting discussion. I would say it went in a different direction than I thought it would, but still a very important direction and a very important discussion. I think a couple of things. One, we talked about earlier the temporal issues. We got a short term and a longer term. We can't lose sight of the longer term, but obviously we need to resolve the short term too. Secondly, there were a ton of as others have said, a ton of very interesting ideas put forth today. Some of them I support, some of them I'd like to learn more about. But the point is, and it's the question I was going to ask, and we don't have time to go through another round of questioning, but we need to figure out how do we convene the further discussions. Does FERC even have a role? Should it just be the states? Should it be some sort of mechanism? Should the ISO convene it, and we react later on? There's all questions I have. I'm not really sure the right answer, but clearly there's additional discussion, additional thought needs to be put towards this. I would say the one thing, someone came up to me at one of the breaks and said, you never raised climate change as an issue, and FERC does not. We're not we don't regulate the environment. We're not a climate change regulator. We've had a lot of discussions about it among the commissioners, so I won't get into that now because that'll keep us here all night. But
thank you.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say this is that our job is to react to what the states in whatever region have decided, and clearly the New England states, especially at least 5 of the 6, and maybe all 6, have decided to embark on a pretty ambitious approach towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Some of us may not like it. Some of us, myself, think it's a great idea, but it's not for FERC to decide one way or the other. But what it is for us, what role there is for us, and I think for NERC as well, is to ensure that what the decisions and choices the states make, that we have to ensure that or try to, as much as we can, to ensure that the bulk power system operates in a reliable manner. And so that's what we're faced with here. And these are obviously very difficult discussions, and they involve other issues such as fuel as well. But I for one, and I think all my colleagues, don't want to speak for all my colleagues, but I think all my colleagues would probably agree that we stand ready to roll up our sleeves, work with you all, and to the extent you determine that it's helpful for us to be involved. But again, I want to thank everyone for participating today. I want to thank just quickly, if I can quickly, the FERC staff that participated today, because they did an amazing job, led by Ernesto Guzman and Mary Wershbrecki from OPI. They led this process and did a really tremendous job. But I also want to thank Emma Nicholson, Aaron Siskine, Lance Henricks, David Burns, David Hunger, Eric Jacoby, Adam Bernarczyk, sorry, I screwed that up, Seth Jensen, Brian White, Corellis Olmedo Alvarez, Catherine Schuck, Eric Winterbauer, Carla Pettis, David Moranville, I'm almost halfway done, Susan Jalali, Taylor Webster, Philip Lee, Rebecca Vertis, Nathan Olesky, Sarah McKinley, Rob Thurmeyer, Keith Mazil, Paul Van Ness, Mazo Mola, Dennis Gray, Joshua Hill, almost done, Tyrone Simpkins, Timmy Baker, Gerard Linman, and Deward Massey. Want to point out two other things. I want to also thank our OPI, our Office of Public Participation that Commissioner Tierney mentioned. They were out in the hallway today. They're still there. I think they're a big part of this in terms of this discussion of how to make sure, because everyone's here, a lot of people are involved in the stakeholder discussions, but not everyone is. How do we make sure that they're involved, at least in the FERC proceedings, and understand their opportunities, and want to thank them, and we'll take advantage of them, their role on a going forward basis. And then finally, we are going to provide an opportunity for people to file comments if they want in this docket. We're not going to ask specific questions, but just in general, want people to comment. And I imagine after the discussion today, there'll be a lot of documents filed with us. So we look forward to reading them. And with that, we stand adjourned. So thank you very much.